Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Early in 2021, I was given the opportunity to read a book with the most sensational title I've ever come across. Hitler's Brothel was a book inspired by true events, coming alive on the page due to an incredible amount of research on the author's part. Compelling and incredibly telling, it opened my eyes even further to the cruelties inflicted on humanity by the Nazi regime during World War II. This month, author Steve Matthews is back with a follow-up to that incredibly unique novel. Hitler's Assassins is the second book in Steve's Nazi trilogy, which has just been released by Big Sky Publishing. A book that takes us behind the scenes of Hitler's megalomania and paranoia during his reign as Fuhrer through the eyes of his personal staff and his closest military advisors. Listeners, this book is unlike anything I've ever read before and offers another eye-opening, chilling insight into what can only be described as a reign of absolute terror. And if you're a history buff, then this book will certainly offer a unique glimpse into events of our recent past. It is with such delight that I welcome Steve back to the podcast today. Hi, Steve.
Hello, Claudine. Thank you very much for having me back. I must have done all right the first time. Or if I come back to apologise.
Perfectly the first time round, and it was such a joy to chat to you then as it is today. You know, I got my gushing over and done with before we started recording, but gosh, what an incredible foray into history this novel was. This book gets up close and personal to Adolf Hitler and his interactions with staff, along with key players of the Nazi regime who were tasked with carrying out his evil plans. Steve, can you tell me more about this story and where the inspiration for it came from?
Yeah, I'll be pleased to. My publishers, Big Sky Publishing, when they got the first manuscript for Hitler's Brothel, they said, is there any way we can do this into a 3-book series? And in a sense, there wasn't, because Hitler's Brothel opened and closed in the current era. But they sent me a document which was really, really fascinating. After the Second World War, the Americans, the Russians, and the Brits gathered up as many of Hitler's personal staff as they could. They wanted to know what the real man was like and how he made his decisions, that type of thing. So not only did they have people like Goering and Himmler they arrested from his inner circle, they had his cook, his valet, his train driver, his chauffeur, and they got them all to write statements about their life and times with Hitler. And my publishers, Big Sky, they got me a statement from Hitler's housemaid. So she was the lady who went in. She was actually his chambermaid, and she went in and made his bed, scrubbed his bath, scrubbed his toilet, made sure he had the right razor blades and the right soap and all that sort of stuff. And included in the document was some statements from his valet. And the valet was responsible for laying out his clothes for the day, making sure they were dry cleaned, all that sort of stuff. And it was absolutely enthralling. And the way they wrote them was very matter of fact, but I could see all these people and all the goings on in the Berghof. I could see it in front of my eyes. And that's where the inspiration for the second book came from, to look really closely at the man, because as dreadful and the most awful human being probably to have walked the earth, he's also one of the most fascinating, because there were so many contradictions in his personality.
Made for absolutely riveting reading from that point of view, obviously. So tell me about the story.
Well, the story again is based a little bit on fact, because Hitler, just before the war started, he had his cook shot. She had apparently stolen a bottle of mineral water from the Fuhrer fridge, and everything was logged and accounted for through Martin Bormann, Hitler's offsider there. And it's not known whether Bormann was trying to have a relationship with the cook and she turned him down, so he planted the bottle or what, nobody knows. But basically, Hitler had a shot, so he had to recruit another cook. And I read this somewhere in the research, and I said, well, there's my space. That's where I come in to get up close and personal. So that's how I invented Clara. And I wanted to make readers have empathy with her, because she'd had a very sad life. I wanted to put a little bit of humor in it as well, and there is a little bit there, but I wanted it to feel really real, really authentic. And I think I achieved that in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Fun fact that I learnt from this book, if you can call it fun at all, there were more than 40 attempts on Hitler's life since his meteoric rise to power as the leader of the Nazi Party, a fact that I was unaware of until I read this book. It meant that Hitler was a highly paranoid man, something that I thought you explored incredibly well in this novel by highlighting the extreme measures that were put in place to protect his life. So I wanted to ask you, Steve, how much of what you included in this book was fact and how much was fiction?
Oh gosh, Claudine, probably more of it was fact than fiction.
Mm.
So when I talk about, for instance, when I write about Eva Braun and the Christmas presents, that genuinely was Hitler's most favorite task of the year.
Mm.
He'd send Martin Bormann out with a truck with a list, and Bormann would come back with all the presents, and he and Eva would sit down for 2 days. They had a present room at the Berghof, and they'd sit down for 2 days and wrap these things, and he'd write personal handwritten notes to every single member of his staff, and there were hundreds of them. So that was true. The fact that he received royalties because he had his image on postage stamps, that was true. So all these little sort of snippets of fact as you go through the book, they're all true, they're all real, and that helped me authenticate the story.
Yeah. So, I mean, the things that I found really interesting was, for example, and you mentioned it a little bit before, that, all of his food was logged, everything that related to feeding him. So Clara was his cook and she only cooked for him. Nobody else was permitted to cook for him. And he had utensils and plates and everything that were used only for him. And there was an official taster, somebody who had to eat his food before he was permitted to even go near the food. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, actually, he didn't have one taster, Claudine. He had 13.
Oh, my goodness.
And they were all ladies. But that was just too difficult to weave into a story to have 13. So, of course, I put the horrible grub into the story as his taster. Yeah. But, I don't know. I wonder whether the Queen has a taster. Probably not. I don't know.
I wonder too.
Yeah.
It'd be fascinating.
Yeah, I don't think she would, but I imagine Churchill probably would have done during the war years. I don't know. I suppose you'd have to be paranoid to have them, but you'd also have to be sensible, because there were many attempts on Churchill's life as well. A lot of them have only recently been documented. So, yeah, paranoia comes into it, but common sense as well. So the taster was an interesting little sideline to the story, an interesting twist to it.
Okay, so Operation Valkyrie in July of 1944 was the most well-known assassination attempt on Hitler's life. It marked a significant line in the sand for Germans' faith in Hitler's plan for world domination, didn't it?
It did, because Hitler survived the assassination attempt, as we all know, and he was actually in a wooden shed. He wasn't in the bunker. The bunker wasn't ready for him. Hitler's assassins, that part of the story is dead true. And when the bomb went off, it had been planted behind a table leg on a huge oak table, and the table leg shielded Hitler from the blast. He was wounded, he had nerve damage, and he had a lot of shrapnel damage from the timber, that splinters, that type of thing. But the very same afternoon, he met with Mussolini, who arrived by train for a predetermined meeting. And there's photographs, if anyone cares to search for them, of Hitler holding up his trousers that he was wearing when the explosion happened. And they are absolutely shredded to pieces. It's just amazing. It looks like someone's attacked them with a knife and a pair of scissors. So the German public, after Mussolini left, the German public heard Hitler on the radio. And they already knew there'd been an attempt on his life and that he was still alive. And there he was talking. And they thought it must be divine intervention. It had to be, he was blown up, and yet there he was talking, and people saw him. He made himself available to the public a little bit after that, certainly to his soldiers and all his advisors and the military people that he dealt with. So he truly believed that God was on his side, even though he didn't believe in God.
Mm,
There were times when he quoted God or said, God help us, and things like this.
mm.
He truly believed there was some kind of divine intervention to keep him going, and that ultimately Germany would win the war.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me about the fallout of Operation Valkyrie. I mean, it was in fact people close to him or people within the party itself that actually conspired to kill him.
Yeah, it was. There's quite a good film the Americans made about it called Valkyrie.
Mm.
Tom Cruise was in it, and I think Tom Cruise is a fine actor, but it doesn't quite carry because he's got an American accent. And a lot of the cast in the film have American accents, but it's very well made. The minute that it was determined that Hitler had survived the attack, the Gestapo were out hunting for people. I can't remember off the top of my head how many they got, but basically they got them all pretty well, immediately either shot or hung. But there was quite a substantial number of senior people that were involved in the attempt. Hitler must have had sleepless nights about that afterwards, because he certainly became more paranoid after the event, after that big explosion, that's for sure.
More than Hitler's interactions with his military personnel, I thought his encounters with Clara revealed the horror of the man that Hitler truly was. He was
Mm.
expansively generous to his loyal followers on the one hand and devastatingly cruel to those whom he believed had betrayed him. So I wanted to ask you, what research did you do to get insight into the kind of paradoxical man he was?
A lot of it, I didn't actually research that specifically. It just came
Mm.
out of the research.
Yeah.
For instance, the mineral water in the cook. There was no question about it. The bottle of mineral water was in her room. She must have stolen it, so they shot her.
Yeah.
Um, Another interesting thing was the Sippenfeld laws. That I don't want to say too much about that for
Yeah.
people who haven't read the book, but Clara gets involved in that. And basically those laws, they were real, and they were brought in to trap more Jews. I'll give you an example, Claudine. You've been accused by the Gestapo of some crime or other.
Mm.
You go to a court and you're found guilty, but not only are you guilty, everybody with the same bloodline as you, so your children, your parents, your aunties, they're all guilty as well. And they all get arrested and either executed or sent to concentration camps and die there. And that law was real. It's peculiar. The first law that the Nazi Party passed was against animal cruelty. Hitler hated people who are cruel to animals,
Oh,
but he sent babies to gas chambers and all the horrendous things that happened. There's such a paradox there, isn't there? All those things came out with the research time and time again. So I tried very hard to tie them into the story and get Clara involved in them as well, obviously to gain reader sympathy and empathy, because all the books I write, the adult books I write, are really based on strong female protagonists.
mm.
And I do that deliberately because I'm married to a very strong woman who I admire greatly. And my mum and Diane's mum, I worship them because of what they are as well as who they are.
Yeah.
And I like to write about that. It's time that people acknowledge the strength of women. So I try all these 3 Hitler books and the one before that, The Skinny Girl, they're all about the strength of women. And I try to make them more than just a historical document. I like them to have a bit of a thriller element, some suspense in them as well. So
Mm.
people keep turning the pages.
Yeah, as I said, I think that Clara's character really did shine a light on that, the paradox that Hitler was. And I think that Clara's observations of the Fuhrer during her employment kind of mirror the rise and fall of the Third Reich in many respects, doesn't it? I mean, at
Yeah.
first she's in awe of Hitler and she's sensible to the honor bestowed upon her by being recruited to her position as cook, only to eventually have that reverence replaced by revulsion once she realizes the kind of man he really is.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. And I believe in reality that happened to a lot of people who got close to him.
Mm.
And it happened to the German public as well, particularly when Berlin was bombed unbelievably by the Americans and the British, and then the Russians encircled the city. And the German public knew they were going to lose the war and they were going to become victims themselves. And Hitler called them all cowards. I mean, he told his military to destroy all the properties, shoot all the civilians, anyone who got in the way, just kill them, because they're all cowards, they all failed, they all let him down. It's amazing that one person, one human being, his desires can result in more than 60 million people dying. If I wrote the book without the history being there, people would say, oh, don't be so ridiculous, that couldn't happen. Yeah. But it did, and it happened in this current century, and it's just awful, but it's compelling as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a case, most certainly the case of the truth being stranger than fiction in many respects. Yeah, and I found it so interesting that he was calling the German people cowards while he was 55 feet underneath the ground in his bunker.
Yeah.
Hiding away. Yeah. Something else I found really interesting was the fact that in addition to mental health issues, Hitler that is, suffered from chronic gut problems and was regularly administered various drugs by his personal physician to combat the effects of this condition. So can you tell me a little bit more about this and how you uncovered this in your research?
I'd love to talk about that because it really fascinates me. Hitler's doctor was called Morell, Dr. Morell. He was considered to be a bit of a quack, and he had a couple of practices around Berlin. And one day Hitler was in with his photographer, and Hitler bent over double with a stomach cramp or something. And the photographer knew Morell, he rang Morell, Morell came over and injected Hitler with something that Hitler had no idea what it was, but it solved the problem. And so he immediately persuaded Morell to close all his practices and come and become Hitler's personal physician. And Morell gave Hitler some tablets, which apparently were available at the time. They were called Dr. Coaster's anti-gas tablets. They contained a mixture of different things, including cyanide and belladonna, would you believe? They were actually in the tablets, and Hitler took a dozen of them a day for years. Hitler's biggest fear in public life was flatulence, was passing wind when he was in front of 5,000 people speaking at the microphone. We've all got that fear, but yeah. Certainly not to the extent that he had. And Morell was also supplying on the side. He was supplying Hermann Goering with morphine because Goering was shot during the beer hall putsch years ago, and he developed a morphine habit. So Goering was getting barbiturates. Hitler was having all sorts of things injected into him, including, would you believe, animal feces. Oh. And the reason I know all this is because Morell was arrested after the war, and he handed over his records of Hitler's treatment. So it's all there now for the general public to look at and wonder at. Some of the things he injected into Hitler were just amazing. But the Germans called him Dr. Feelgood. Morell was called Dr. Feelgood because until the end of the war, at least, whatever was wrong with you, he could inject you with something or give you a tablet for something, and away you went. I mean, I'm trying to think what the main drugs were. There was cocaine, and Eucadol is one of the ones. They found with Eucadol, which was basically a methamphetamine, that if they gave it to the soldiers became fearless. So this is how the Blitzkrieg came about, because Hitler wanted to literally blitzkrieg into countries, but he needed his tank drivers and his artillery people and the soldiers on the ground to stay awake for 3 days at a time and just literally just blitz through a country, which is what they did. And they did it on the strength of that tablet called Eucadol, which was basically a stimulant. And the German military, I can't remember how many, it was 60 million doses of it or something like that they ordered before the war. And all their crews, all their tank crews, and as I say, all the soldiers on the ground, they all had it and they stayed awake for 3 days. And that's how they conquered Poland so easily. They were maniacs, Claudine. They were absolute fearless maniacs because of the drugs.
It is horrifying to read of those kinds of events and how they were fueled, really. I mean, much is made of the fact that Hitler's mental state deteriorated quite significantly throughout the war and towards the end. I mean, is it any wonder that he was the way he was with all the things that he was being injected with and all the pills that he was popping? I mean, I'm not making excuses, but my God.
I often thought while I was writing that book, because it sort of charts the history of the war years, I often thought, my God, we're so lucky that Hitler made a couple of vital mistakes. Otherwise, the war could have gone the other way. I mean, the first big mistake he made was Dunkirk.
Yeah.
Virtually the whole of the British army was on that beach and half the French army. And all he had to do was round them up. And they had tank units and soldiers everywhere just waiting to do it. And Hitler said, no, let's go and invade Russia instead. And he let the British army be rescued. And he blamed Goering then for the failure, because the British army were rescued, as we all know, thank goodness. And of course, the other big mistake he made was invading Russia. Yeah. I mean, he invaded just before winter, or as winter was on the horizon, which was a ridiculous thing to do. And he thought he'd be able to blitzkrieg like he did in Poland and France and all the other countries. So the world could be a very different place if Hitler had made the right decision from the German viewpoint at Dunkirk anyway.
Let's talk about Hitler's death. I think it's important to point out that in the lead up to this event, the Russian army had advanced on Berlin, as you mentioned before, and Germany's fall seemed imminent. As a result, Hitler was determined not to be taken alive by the Russians and resolved to commit suicide. Now, most historical reports indicate that Hitler committed suicide in his bunker alongside his new wife, Eva Braun, and that their bodies were taken from the bunker and burned in a bomb crater outside the bunker. Now, for many years, this was accepted as fact, but recent discoveries have put that theory in doubt, something which you explore in this book. So tell me a little bit about that.
Okay, you say recent events have put it in doubt, and you're dead right, because when the 75th anniversary of the end of the war came up last year or the year before, the Russians, the Americans and the Brits and the French released a lot of top secret documents that had never been released before. People that study history, professors and war experts, they've flooded into all these document centers and gone through a lot of information that was previously unknown. The Americans recently, through a TV program, employed a CIA expert, and I can't remember who the other fellow was, but basically they were involved in hunting down bin Laden and people like that very successfully. And the TV program said to these fellows, well, off you go and see whether Hitler died or not. So they started right at the start, and they realized there was no real evidence that Hitler was dead. The Russians had some remains, which they were allowed to go and examine. The Russians claimed they were genuine, but these forensic fellows thought they weren't. And in fact, they claimed to have stolen a tiny little piece of the skull that the Russians said was Hitler's skull. When they took it back to America, they tested it. It was a woman's skull. So either they got Eva Braun mixed up with Hitler, or it wasn't Hitler. There's lots of talk of people in South America seeing Hitler at opera shows and in monasteries. And the further you go into it, the more speculative it becomes, but also the more compelling. And the third book in the series, which is called Hitler's Resurrection, assumes that Hitler has lived. And Clara from book 2 and Natalka from book 1, Natalka was the Slav, the underground operative. She was his girlfriend. These two women find out they're related, and they go Nazi hunting in book 3. And I'm just in the process of finalizing book 3. I hope by the end of November, it'll go to the editors. So that's the one I've had most fun on, because you can't research very much with it, because nobody knows whether Hitler lived or not. Yeah. So the fictional side of my brain was working very hard on that, and I enjoyed it. It was good fun.
Honestly, Steve, I could talk to you about this book all day. It was utterly fascinating, and just threw up so many different things that I hadn't been aware of, or, obviously challenged accepted theories about this. So, Steve, what would you like readers to take away from this novel?
I think, first of all, I want readers to enjoy the fact that we have female protagonists. They win out in the end, and they're strong people, and women can do those sorts of things. They can do lots of things that men can't do. And whilst I don't mean that to sound patronizing, but I firmly believe it. And that's one of the messages I tried to put through. The other thing is, when I wrote the first two books, and I'm just finishing the last book, I can't help asking myself, what would I have done had I been in that situation? Not in Hitler's situation, but as a member of his staff, or in the first book, being taken to work in a concentration camp against my will. And that's really, I want to make people think about it. Some friends of mine said to me, what on earth are you writing about the war for? You know, for goodness sake, it was 75 years ago. Can't we move on? And I said to them, no, we can't move on. We must never, ever move on. And we must never, ever forget what happened. When we do, that's like opening the door. That's like allowing other people to continue with it. Those are the two things, the strength of women and the personal question, the deep down question, you know, would I have rounded up the Jews if I was a German and they said to me, do it, or we're going to hang you or shoot you? I don't know. But those are deep questions, aren't they? And it doesn't hurt to ask yourself them sometimes. Before COVID came in, we did a couple of talks at some Rotary clubs, and a couple of the fellows came out afterwards and told us stories about their parents during the war. I mean, one of them worked in the underground in Poland. I mean, and I've touched on that in the first book, but can you imagine doing that? I mean, and the French underground, the resistance in France. Yeah. I mean, one mistake and all your family are shot instantly, as well as you. Where these people got the courage from, I do not know. And I often wonder myself whether I'd be brave enough to do it. I think not. I don't know.
I think the same thing myself, I'm afraid. Yeah, I don't know that I'd be that strong. So the last time we chatted, you were kind enough to offer some tips for writers who listen to this podcast. This time, I wondered if you might share some insights about your writing process. How often do you write? And, do you wait for the muse to strike, or is it more of a disciplined process for you?
I'm afraid I'm very indisciplined or undisciplined. I'm an emotional writer, so I feel the urge and I write as long as I need to write, which can be 10, 12, 14 hours sometimes. Yeah, without a break. I mean, just get up, have a cup of tea and walk around. I've got into a routine. I've got a research routine and I've got a writing routine, but I never write a story. I never have a story in my head before I start. I only have the ending. Always I've got an ending. I think, wow, imagine turning the last page after that happened. It would leave you thinking. And I sort of build from that, or I work towards that. John Grisham, for instance, every chapter in his book is planned out before he writes them. So he does a sort of roadmap of his story, right from the very first page to the very last page. Jeffrey Archer, for instance, and I'm certainly not comparing myself to him, I'm only comparing the technique. He's the same as I am. He has a good ending and he thinks, wow, that'll make a good book. Off we go. And he's got no idea what's going to happen page to page because it comes into his head or doesn't, as the case may be. So that's how I work. I don't know what I'm going to write. And I only know how it's going to resolve at the end of the book.
Fantastic. So do you do all your research before you start working on your book, or is that something that you do as you're writing as well?
90% of the research I do before I write a book. So I know all for instance, the Hitler's assassins, I knew all those facts, and I have a notebook and I tag each section. So I'd have a bit on the Third Reich, a bit on the Battle of Berlin, a bit on Russia. I'd have all those bits all labeled out in a book. So I've got all my facts there, and then I just pray to God that something comes into my head when I start to write it, but it always seems to.
You've done pretty well so far, I have to say.
Well, thank you. The books are based on research, but the stories aren't based on research. Yeah, they might be founded on it, like the instance of Hitler's cook, but that's where it ends,
Are there things that you know about yourself as a writer now that you didn't when you first started out?
That's an interesting question. That's a hard one to answer. I don't know. I'm very emotional. The Skinny Girl, I cried when I wrote a few parts of that. It affected me so much. So I don't know. Yeah, there probably are. If I sat and thought about it, Claudine, there probably are. It certainly broadens your horizons, but it makes some people suspicious. I was being given a tour of I don't know whether, I better not say where it was. I was giving a tour of these premises, and I kept asking questions. And the person who took me around was quite a senior police officer. And he stopped halfway through and said, "You're a journalist, aren't you? You're going to write about this." And I said, "I assure you I'm not a journalist, but I might write about some of the things." So I'm always inquisitive, and all writers are, and I'm sure you are as well, because you're so interested in books. You get into situations or you meet new people and you want to know the whys and wherefores. It's fascinating. People are fascinating, and circumstances, they're fascinating too, aren't they?
I couldn't agree with you more. Steve, if listeners wanted to find out more about you and your books, where can they do that?
www.stevematthewsauthor.com. Thank you for that wonderful plug, Claudine. Or through my publishers, Big Sky Publishing. Yeah, so all the information people would want there. And there's a contact page. So I get a lot of correspondence from people. I get quite a few emails. I've actually had some threatening ones. When I wrote Hitler's Brothel, after that came out, I had 3 or 4 threatening emails from Holocaust deniers. One of them was in Sydney and told me to watch my back. I also had the most amazing email from a group of neo-Nazis in Berlin on Facebook. These fellows were stood in front of a massive swastika doing the Hitler salute, and that was the front page of their Facebook page. And it's illegal to do that in Germany. You can't do the Hitler salute, and you can't put a swastika out anywhere, even privately, you can't do it. But they were there on Facebook. My publisher told me, don't engage with these people, just block them and delete them immediately. So that's what I've done. Despite all the education and all the proof that there's been over all these 75, 76 years, people still deny that things took place. It's weird.
Well, I hope you don't get any more of those nasty messages. All
Thank
of my
you.
listeners are nice listeners, I assure you.
Of course they are. Of course they are. These people are just nutcases.
Steve, I wanted to say that it's been such a pleasure to chat with you again today. I wish you every success with this book. Thank you very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Thanks, Claudine, and thanks for all your listeners and everybody who's bought the book or borrowed it from a library. And book 3 comes out next year, 2022, in October, Hitler's Resurrection.
Fantastic. What a title. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.